Hello and welcome back to A Tale of Genetic Code. This is the channel where I share my journey as I learn and explore the world of genetics. So let's get into our first video, which would be on the cells of life. So before we go into what are the different types of organisms and what are the cells and multicellular organisms that make up the uh, realm of the living, let us first ponder upon what is life, right? So this is a very seemingly very complicated definition of life. Let's just look at it and break it down into its components. So this one says that living cells contain both RNA and DNA, and that they can use the genetic information that is encoded in this genetic material to synthesize proteins. And they should not just be able to synthesize protein, but they should also be able to do so by using energy that they generate themselves. So you might think that it's such a complicated definition and very randomly put together, containing things including RNA, DNA, protein, energy. Shouldn't the definition of life be simpler? And you're probably right, but there is a reason behind this particular definition of life, and that is actually to exclude viruses from this realm, to keep the classification of living organisms more sane and to give viruses their own special status as a type of organism in the in between the living and dead. We use this very uh, crafty definition of life, which essentially was made just to exclude viruses from the realm of living. And now that we understand to some extent what life is, which actually is just, so this definition just means that the organism should contain genetic material and it should be able to make its structural components, namely proteins, from genetic materials using the energy that it generates on its own by taking substrates for energy production from its environment. So this is essentially what this definition means. And if we subscribe to this definition of life, then there are all of these entities that come under its purview. So this green blob here contains all the living cells as per the definition that we quoted above. And if before we go further, if we just look at what is below it, the things that we exclude from the definition of life is what we call gene creatures. So this is the group which contains very interesting organisms, if I can call them organisms, viroids, heterotransposons. So let me just open this. So you can see that you can have viruses which contain RNA, viruses which contain DNA. There might be some viruses which contain both RNA and DNA, and that is why the definition is so important because even if the virus contains RNA, DNA, a bit of proteins, a virus still cannot generate its own energy to replicate itself. So that definition essentially just kicks the virus group, the entire gene creatures group, in fact, out of the basket of life. And the term gene creatures doesn't just include the viruses, which are actually the most complex of these entities, but also simpler entities that we keep coming across, including plasmids, transposons, and viroids. So maybe in future videos we will actually take a deeper look into each of these. But for the sake of this video, we'll just uh, skip this and we will move on to the realm of the living. So once we want to go here, how do we classify the extremely wide range of living things that surround us, that we probably don't even know of that have ever lived. So that this definition of life actually encapsulates every organism that probably has ever lived, right? So this has to be a very broad and very meticulously thought of classification because it has to include basically everything. So the classification system itself has several layers. So at the highest level, we have the domain, and then we have the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, gender, and species. So this is the order uh, in which an organism is classified. So each, for example, every organism belongs to a species, which belongs to genera, family, order, and so on till the domain. And domains themselves are only three. So they are the archaebacteria, the eubacteria, and the eukaryota. And if you want to compress this further, the eukaryota and the prokaryota, which includes both archaea and eubacteria. So let us just take a brief look into each of these. So let's start with archaebacteria. These are extremely fascinating organisms. So here, of course, the picture is not showing you any archaebacteria, but it is showing you the kind of environments where you might find them. So, for example, here is a hot water, a pool of hot water that is being heated by volcanic activity deep within the crust of the earth. And that heated water is dissolving a lot of inorganic material and minerals from the rocks uh, that it is coursing through and coming to the surface of the earth, cooling down, and then depositing this inorganic material around these pools of water. And you might imagine the temperatures here rising to almost boiling point, and here thrive organisms called extremophiles, which are all archaebacteria. So, if you think of the entire group of archaebacteria, you can broadly classify them into these things called extremophiles, which live in such extreme conditions, and then the archaebacteria that live in more tolerable conditions uh, uh, with our respect, tolerable with respect to our comfort, and that group is methanogens. So even if their habitat is more normal as compared to the extremophiles, methanogens themselves contain very different cellular structure, and their biological processes for generation of energy are very different, and that is why they are grouped together with archaebacteria. So you might ask me, why are archaebacteria, eubacteria, and eukaryota separated, and why did I say that archaebacteria and eubacteria could further be compressed into something called prokaryota? So the difference between the prokaryota, which includes archaebacteria and eubacteria, and the eukaryota is that the eukaryota contain further organization within the cell to form cell intercellular organelles, which are absent in the prokaryota. So that is the major difference between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. And eubacteria contain all the bacteria that we are more familiar with. This is what we think of when we think of the term bacterium, a single cellular organism with a nucleoid which contains the genetic material. In the same compartment in which the nucleoid is present are the other cellular components that uh, help the bacteria carry out its cellular processes. And bacteria are such fascinating creatures because they're so small. They're extremely small, and of course not to the scale of viruses. But then these are some of the smallest living organisms, and viruses were kicked out of the group of living organisms. So yeah, so the bacteria are, like I said, surrounded by a cell membrane, and most of these also have a cell wall and another cellular membrane outside the cell wall. So all these are their adaptations to live in the environments in which they thrive. But bacteria are extremely fascinating because of some of these things that I'm going to tell you about now. So you see, I have come across some statistics about bacteria that are going to blow your mind. So one is that the bacterial cell cultures, when they are mature, they can contain as many as a billion cells per ml of the culture fluid. So that is like two-thirds of the population of India in a single milliliter of culture fluid. The total number of bacteria on our planet is estimated to be an astronomical 5 into 10 raised to the power 30, and the total amount of bacterial carbon is equal to the total amount of carbon found in plants. Can you imagine how insane that is? And just look at this one. Over half of the living matter on Earth is microbial, and we see so many macroscopic animals and plants, and they are so huge and they occupy so much space, but hiding within and around them all is half of the living matter, which we cannot see. And look at this line, and I'm sure you must have heard it elsewhere as well. But for every human cell in our body, there are 10 bacteria. So our body itself is more of bacteria than our own cells. And actually, these statistics are more, uh, uh, you know, they are more interesting when you bring viruses into the picture because parts of viruses can be found in the genome of every organism, and that includes, of course, humans, and not just in one or two copies, but hundreds of them and thousands of them. So probably if you had included viruses in the definition of life, you would come across a really big conundrum as to whether a cell is a part of a human body or it's like culture medium for viruses. So it is a good decision that the scientists made to keep viruses outside of this classification. And now let's come to the eukaryota. So these are all. So these three domains of life and these four kingdoms within the domain of eukaryota contain every organism that has ever lived, that contains every organism which we see around us, which we do not see around us, but which exist, which have existed in the past ever since the first organism was born or created. And at this point, you can this simple classification of these six entities, these four things called Protista, Plantae, Fungi, Animalia, and the Eukaryota and the Prokaryota containing Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. These six groups contain every organism known to man. And let's just so when we are speaking at this stage, like uh, groups broad enough to include every single organism, they have to have really, really broad definitions, right? And so we'll see what definitions scientists have given to each of these groups. What are the criteria that an organism must satisfy in order to be placed into one of these groups? So for plants, it is pretty straightforward. The cell of a plant should contain both a mitochondrion and a chloroplast and should be photosynthetic. So, like I said again, these are very broad definitions. Some parasitic plants do not perform photosynthesis. However, they do contain chloroplasts or remnants of chloroplasts, which are further modified to serve other purposes. But by and large, plant cells should have a mitochondrion and a chloroplast, and they are typically covered by a rigid cell wall which contains cellulose. So that is what a plant is. And for the sake of definition, this is what a fungus is. It is a cell which contains a mitochondrion but does not contain a chloroplast. And it also contains a cell wall, but it lacks cellulose and it contains something called chitin. And in fact, initially we had thought that the fungi were more closely related to plants, and probably during evolution, plants lost their chloroplasts and then became fungi. But recent studies have shown that fungi are probably more genetically closer to animals than they are to plants. So they are a separate group altogether, right? And then finally we come to animals. So in the same spirit of defining a cell of an animal, animal cells should lack chloroplast but should possess mitochondria, and they differ from both fungi and plants in lacking a rigid cell wall. And most of us know that we know that most of the animals are mobile. So these are such simple definitions that encapsulate a vast, vast majority of living organisms. And then we come to something called the protista. So the protista are actually an artificial group. It's not very clearly defined, but what it serves as is a wastebasket where you put organisms which do not fit into the other three categories. And as such, they are very, very diverse, and there have been recent attempts to classify them more rationally. And in this one classification, uh, which includes all the organisms, right from this protists to plants and fungi and animals. So this is quite extensive and probably outside the scope of this video, and probably we'll discuss this in a subsequent one. So that, to an extent, actually concludes this video. And to summarize, we have seen this tree of life, which from which we have excluded these gene creatures. And in the living cells, we have the prokaryotes, which contain eukaryotes, which contains bacteria and archaebacteria, and the eukaryotes, which contain protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Thank you.